All right, well, welcome back to Contemporary Economic Policy Issues. My name is Jon Haveman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Economic Education Delegation, NEED, and NEED is your hosts for this class. Here are a set of topics on which NEED frequently speaks. And let me put out an invitation to anybody who watches the video that we're happy to come into any other group that brings in speakers, whether you're a member of Kiwani or Rotary. Or retirement community or what have you. Be delighted to try to set you up with an economist to speak on any of these issues. We do have a few economists relatively close to Casper, so maybe it could even be in person. Our talks are free unless it's for a corporation or someplace with deep pockets. Then we do hope that you'd come up with some sort of a charitable donation to NEED. Okay, so those are topics on which we speak. Here is the course that we've been through thus far. I hope you enjoyed Kelly last week with economic inequality. This week you've got me for autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. Okay, so let's dig into it. I'll forget this, but the slides are up on the NEED website already, should you be interested in going through them again. All right, so today we've got driving change, autonomous vehicles, big impact. It seems a little bit of a stretch that autonomous vehicles would be in this class, but it turns out that there are some pretty big economic policy issues associated with autonomous vehicles. It's also the case that I'm really very intrigued with them and the economic changes that they're going to bring. All right, so this is a slide deck that I wrote actually before I founded NEED. I founded NEED about 5 years ago, so I started writing this 6 or 7 years ago. It has since been reviewed by Ron Fisher at Michigan State, William Fox at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and they agree with the material in it and think that it fits in the mainstream of economics. So, all right, let's go ahead. What are we going to do? We're going to talk a little bit about where the autonomous vehicle path leads. What is the world going to look like when we have fully made the transition? We'll talk a little bit about what that transition might look like, and then we'll talk about some policy and some planning issues and major economic and development changes that will come. Before I get started, I'd like to give a taxonomy of autonomous vehicles. There's a range, a scale of autonomous vehicles that goes from level 0 up here to level 5. Level 0 is what I imagine most of us drive. It may have cruise control, but if you turn on the cruise control and you stop paying attention, you can run right into the car in front of you. And that's because the car can't see at all, right? And seeing is really how I think about moving up the scale from level 0 to level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And basically, the better the car can see, the higher up the scale it's going to be. So level 0 cars can't see at all. Level 1 cars can see a little bit, as they may have things like adaptive cruise control. That is, the car will slow down if you're getting too close to the car in front of you. May have parking assist and lane keeping assist and some other simple rudimentary autonomous features. Level 2, the system can do the driving by itself, but not in all circumstances. And you really do have to be sitting in the driver's seat with your hands ready to take over the steering wheel because, well, the car can see, but not as well as we might like. Level 3 is where, now we're getting someplace. You can sit, you still need to sit in the driver's seat, but you can take your hands off the wheel, you can read a book, you can text, you can do other things if you want to. Level 4 is really where the car doesn't need a brake pedal, it doesn't need an accelerator or even a steering wheel, right? So the intention is that the human being will never take over. So why is this level 4 and not level 5? It's level 4 for 2 different reasons. One is that we still worry about these cars in a blizzard, all right? So inclement weather may hamper the functioning of these cars, so they can't drive when the weather is bad. And 2, they're geofenced. And what that means is that there's sort of an imaginary fence around the region in which they can operate. They can only operate in regions where it's pretty well mapped and the car understands the area pretty well. And level 5 is the nirvana. That's all robot all of the time. Human beings are just along for the ride. And human beings should never ever have to take over. So that's where we would really like to go. There are some car companies that are trying to climb up this ladder. So Tesla is at about level 2, right, where you have to sit in the driver's seat and keep your hands close to the wheel. Mercedes is reputed to put out a level 3 car pretty soon. And Waymo Waymo is Google's self-driving arm. Waymo has lots of level 4 cars out there. Again, they're geofenced and they can't operate in blizzard. And nobody's really put out a level 5 yet, though many folks think that we're getting close. So let's talk a little bit about the pace of the transition. When are we likely to get there? This is a forecast put out by McKinsey and Company. And they forecast that it'll be about 2030 when autonomous vehicles are sort of readily available, but not until 2050 before autonomous vehicles are the primary means of transport. I really think that this is a conservative estimate. And what I mean by that is that I think that things are going to happen a little bit more quickly. No, scratch that, a lot more quickly than McKinsey thinks. And I'll tell you why that is in just a few minutes. First, let's take a look at what some of the headlines say. And these are headlines that I put in the presentation 4 or 5 years ago. And none of them have come to pass, right? NVIDIA was going to introduce a level 4 system by 2018. Tesla was going to have an fully autonomous vehicle out there by now. It does not, right? So none of this happened. And most of these headlines were put out there to try and raise venture capital money or funding so that progress could be made. You're going to get a lot more funding if you say that we're on the cusp of success, rather than saying, it's going to be 10 years, but we'd like your money now. So the effort to raise money. That said, there are now sort of 40 plus major corporations that are working on autonomous vehicles. You can see all of these corporations are funneling a ton of money towards the issue. And there's tens and tens of billions of dollars being funneled at the development of autonomous vehicles. And part of that is because it's about $1 trillion market. In the event that success is had, there's $1 trillion out there to be had. So why not spend tens of billions of dollars now? All right, so a little bit on my forecast. When do I think that autonomous vehicles are going to be here? Well, from what I see and from the increasing numbers of headlines that say, Waymo's got a new service and Cruise has a new service and lots of these self-driving companies are introducing new services. I think that by 2025, many of us, perhaps not in Casper, Wyoming, but many of us will be able to hail an autonomous vehicle with our phones in much the same way that you hail Uber or Lyft now. And potentially by the year 2035, potentially 95% of the vehicle miles traveled. That's what VMT is vehicle miles traveled. Potentially 95% of the vehicle's miles traveled by 2035 could be autonomous. Last 5% might be difficult to achieve. It might be people in more rural areas. It might be people with special vehicle needs like construction workers. And so the question rises, right, is this possible? Obviously, I think so, or I wouldn't be talking this way. Partly, I think it's possible because I saw pictures of Broadway in New York City. One picture from 1910. And in 1910, there were 99 horses on the road for every car. And by the year 1920, there were 99 cars on the road for every horse. Now this is Broadway, and there was a law that passed in between 1910 and 1920 that said you had to clean up after your horse. So that might have hastened the transition a little bit, right? But that was a 10-year transition period from horses to cars. And I'll argue as we go along that this transition is actually easier than that one. Right, that transition involved every individual buying a car, right? And now this transition is actually going to involve people selling a car, right? Which people are going to find easier to do than buying. So I do think that 10 years is reasonable. People come back at me and say, well, but the adoption of electric vehicles has been so slow. And there are really two things that slow down the adoption of electric vehicles. Well, really three things. One is sticker shock. If you go to the dealer and you look at two versions of the same car, and one is electric and one is gas powered, the gas powered one's going to be cheaper. So people are more inclined to buy that. So there's a sticker shock. There's also the range anxiety. Well, what if I want to drive 700 miles in my car? Am I going to have to stop every 200 miles for 3 hours while the car recharges? That's not appealing. So that's a problem. And the third is all of the bad marketing over the years. I remember, 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of marketing about how electric vehicles are so slow. And back in the day, all the car companies were advertising against electric vehicles because they don't make as much money on electric vehicles as they do in internal combustion engine vehicles. All right, so I think the adoption of autonomous vehicles is going to be pretty fast. Let me show you some of the more recent headlines, right? Waymo again is Google. Their self-driving cars are available in Lyft's app in Phoenix. Now, Phoenix has been a hotbed of testing because Phoenix is a very well laid out city. And it also has almost no weather to speak of, absent the massive rainstorm from time to time. But 9/10 of the year, there's almost no weather. Hyundai has launched a free robotaxi service in California. Singapore's self-driving cars can be hailed with a smartphone, and Cruise is offering robotaxi rides in San Francisco for the public without backup drivers. Now, granted, Cruise is offering that between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. when there aren't very many other cars out on the road. But they're doing it nonetheless, and that represents real progress. I'll show you in a minute. Well, actually, next slide. Here, let's take a look at New York City. All right, so Waymo is now offering ride-sharing services in Manhattan. And I will suggest that if your self-driving cars can make it there, they can make it anywhere. Because frankly, that's a very, very difficult driving environment. And one of the things about this slide is you can see that gray area. That's the Waymo driving territory. And if you imagine a fence around there, that's the geofencing that I was talking about. All right, so Waymo's cars in Manhattan can only function within that gray space. Now, I imagine what Waymo will do is over time, they'll expand the boundaries of that service. They'll map the areas better and they'll have more experience with it. And so they'll expand that to the whole island. Now, not only personal vehicles are a target for autonomy, but trucking is as well. And a lot of people think that trucking is really going to be here way before the personal vehicle service is, right? Partly because there are far fewer trucks and partly because there's a real profit motive, right? So long haul trucking, now you've all probably heard about the driver shortage that exists. The driver shortage, as an economist, I say there's never a shortage. It's only that people aren't willing to pay enough for it. Right? If you pay drivers a lot more, then you find a lot more people willing to drive. But that's a cost associated with drivers, so that makes autonomous vehicles more appealing. And then there are government regulations around how many hours drivers can actually drive. In any 24-hour period, a driver can only be active for 14 hours. And in a 14-hour period, they can only be actively driving for 11 of those hours, right? If you take the driver out of the picture, you can put a truck out on the highway and it can just go 24/7. So that'll lower trucking costs, and it'll actually lower prices for all of the rest of us as well. Where does it stand? Right, there are lots of trials underway. There's a company, Too Simple, that's actively building a network. And then there's Waymo and a bunch of others that are working on trucking, but at a more local level, right? How do you autonomously get things from the warehouse to your house, right? So let's look at Too Simple's network. This is the United States, and the cities marked in black are cities where Too Simple is already using autonomous service. So in much of the southern and southeastern part of the United States, there's already service available. You can see the other cities like Salt Lake City, Denver, San Francisco, and Oakland, all right, cities in yellow, where Too Simple is hoping to expand its service. And it's a very friendly environment out there, regulatory environment. So there are 44 states that allow semi-truck testing, 26 states that allow the deployment of autonomous trucks, and in all 50 states, because the federal government has laid out a framework for autonomous trucks, all 50 states have a framework in existence. All right, so expect the trucks that you see out on the highway, more and more of them will be autonomous over time. So what does the future look like? Well, we could look at the aesthetics. What's the inside of a car going to look like? What's the outside of a car going to look like? As an individual, I'm intensely curious. But as an economist, I really don't care about the aesthetics. What I really care is about the economics. And from an economic standpoint, it turns out that there are two what we call equilibria, right? So two likely outcomes. One is the heaven outcome, and the other is the hell outcome. I won't suggest which one we'd rather, but I think you can guess. Since we don't want the hell outcome, let's talk about what it is and dispense with it. And then for the rest of the talk, we'll talk about what heaven might look like. All right, so in hell, And the hell version of autonomous vehicles is where we've got primarily individual private car ownership, much as today, and the engines are still gas powered, internal combustion. Why? Because the same issues will exist, right? Electric cars might be more expensive, might still have the range anxiety. So if individuals are going out and buying their car, they're still going to buy gas powered. Why is this hell? Well, because as I'll show you in a minute, there's likely to be dramatically increased vehicle miles traveled. Each car is likely to drive a lot more miles. And since they're gas powered, that means a lot more pollution. It also means potentially increased congestion unless we increase the amount of roads we've got out there, which would be a bad byproduct and further the notion that this is the hell outcome. And then these cars are also going to have to park someplace. Right? Parking is going to be a little bit of a recurring theme. I'll mention it a few times as we go through. But first, let's take a look at why it is that I think that vehicle miles traveled could increase enormously with autonomous vehicles. Right? So let's take a family with 2 adults and a child. In the morning, all 3 of them start off at the house. Where's the car? The car isn't necessarily at the house. Why? Because it doesn't have to be. Right? And if it could be parked off someplace remotely where land is cheaper. Right. And if you think about it, having a garage is really kind of an inconvenience. That's kind of a wasted space, unless you're like me and you've got a bunch of junk in your garage. But many people would like to take their garage and turn it into something else. Well, with autonomous vehicles, they can. You can send the car, say, go park off in Timbuktu. So the car might be parked someplace else. And then the first thing that happens in the morning is that the car drives from Timbuktu to the house. Right. And this trip is really important and worth spending a second on because this is additive. Right? This is a car trip that cannot happen now. There are no passengers in the vehicle. And so this is completely new vehicle miles travel. Right. Well, okay. So there are going to be a few more of those trips, but let's go through. What's the next thing that might happen? And I confess that this is a concocted example to show how bad things might be. Things might not be this bad, but the potential is still there. Right. So the next thing that might happen is that the first adult will go off to work in the autonomous vehicle. They'd take the autonomous vehicle because they can send it back to the house to take the child off to school. And then it can go back to the house and take the other adult to their office. And then it can go back to the parking lot. Right. So imagine, if you will, this is the hell version. So trips 1, 3, 5, and 7 are all additive, right? So 4 out of these 7 trips cannot happen today. So they're additive. In addition, this first adult, who knows, maybe they would have taken the bus, maybe they would have taken a ferry, maybe they would have taken a train, maybe they would have carpooled with an office mate. So that might not have happened. And maybe this trip 4, taking the child to school, maybe they would have taken a school bus, right? So many of these trips need not happen, but they're facilitated and they're made appealing by the fact that the car is autonomous, right? And that's just the morning, right? Redo all of this in the evening. So that's a lot more vehicle miles traveled. If the cars are gas powered, that's a lot more pollution. And it also means a lot more vehicles out on the road, which means more congestion. Right. So that's the nuts and bolts of the hell version that we don't want. Right. And it centers around the notion of everybody owning their own car. And with autonomous vehicles, it turns out that is a really bad idea. All right. So let's dispense with hell. Let's go off to heaven. Right. What does heaven look like? Well, heaven is where most of us won't own a car. There will be those of us with specialized vehicle needs who might own our own car, think construction workers. But for the rest of us, we'll use our cell phone to say, I need a car to go to work. I need a car to go to school. I need a car to go to the grocery store. Right. And then Uber, Google, Lyft, Ford, GM, Apple, who I don't know, will send a car to you and provide those services for you. Because the cars will be fleet owned, they will also be electric. Why will they be electric? Well, it turns out that electric cars just break down an awful lot less than do gas-powered engines. Why is that? The most important reason is because electric vehicles, get this, I was just floored by this statistic. Electric engines have 19 moving parts, whereas an internal combustion engine has 1,900 moving parts. Right, and you can imagine that 1 out of 19 is going to happen much more than, 1 out of 1,900 is going to break much more than 1 out of 19. Right, so electric vehicles will be the choice. From an insurance standpoint, the only entity that has anything to say about how the car gets from here to there is the car producer, right? Maybe GM, maybe Waymo, the company that built the car and wrote the software. That's the only company, the only organization or entity that has control over how the car gets from A to B. You and I will tell the car where A and B are, right? But it's how it gets between the two that's at issue. So it'll be product liability. If you know anybody in car insurance, if you know any young people who are thinking about going into selling car insurance, maybe try to dissuade them. And it's not clear when we're going to get there. But I think that for areas where I am, I'm in San Francisco. I think that we're gonna have a lot of autonomous vehicles roaming our roads by the year 2030. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about why it's heaven. Not only are the cars autonomous, but they are shared. You'll have multiple people in the car at the same time. You'll have multiple people using the same car at different times. They're connected. That is to say that through technology, they will communicate with each other, and that can be really important. And they'll be green because they're all electric, right? So that they're shared means that there will be far fewer cars in existence. Studies show that if we wanted to replicate all of the transportation services that we get from our cars now, we could do that with only 4 out of every 10 cars. So we could take 6 out of 10 cars off the road, right? And imagine all of the aluminum, all of the rubber, all of the steel, all of the vinyl that goes into making a car. Well, we only need 4/10 of it now. So that frees up all of those resources to do other things. It also makes them cheaper, so maybe cars will be cheaper. Vehicle miles could go up or could go down, but they'll be more productive and held. There'll be many, many fewer 0 passenger miles with fleets, because the fleet owners don't like 0 passenger miles, and they'll make the car, look very closely for the next ride close to them. So vehicle miles traveled may well go up, but I don't think it will provide the same sort of congestion issues, right? Congestion effects, I think, will be reduced, partly because when I drive down the highway, and I look around to other vehicles, I see most of them have just one person in the car. And that's not such a big deal, that's common, but many, many of the cars are big enough to take 8 people, right? And so if each one of those individuals were in a car for just one person, or even a car for 2 people, you could get a lot more of them on the road. If we right-size the vehicles today, we would reduce congestion enormously. They'll also be able to platoon, autonomous vehicles will. And that means that you can line them up, one car right behind the other, and they can go very, very fast, right? Because they're communicating with each other. And sharing, right? I mentioned sharing. I can take an autonomous vehicle in the morning. You can take the same autonomous vehicle in the afternoon. That's one form of sharing. Another is simultaneously, right? You can imagine a lot of these autonomous vehicles being built so that they could take 8 people. But instead of just putting 8 people in a common space, you could compartmentalize the vehicle so that each individual has their own space, right? They don't have to see, hear, touch, smell anybody else in the vehicle. That would make sharing a lot more appealing than it is today, right? And then there's vehicle-to-vehicle communication, right? I don't know how many times I've been driving down the road, I see a brake light go on 3 lanes over and 300 yards up. And then suddenly there's this cascade of brake lights going on because everybody's worried, oh, what happened? Why should slow down? Well, with autonomous vehicles, that won't happen because every vehicle will know exactly why the first vehicle slowed down. And they'll say, okay, that doesn't matter for me, so I'm not going to slow down. So congestion should be reduced. And there'll be minimal need for parking, right? Because these cars will be wanting to take people from place to place. They won't be parked. All right, so let's talk about why the transition is going to be so fast, right? From a transition perspective, right? From a private perspective, right? There's what we call an adoption dividend, right? There's an adoption dividend because you don't have to own a car. And AAA tells us that in 2021, it costs about $9,700 a year to own a car, right? That's the depreciation, that's the insurance, that's the gas, that's the maintenance, that's the repair, that's all in. That's all of the costs of owning a car. $9,700, that's a lot, right? And it's estimated that the average cost per mile will fall from about 64 cents today, right? 64 cents is how much it costs per mile if you drive about 15,000 miles a year on your car. Well, these cars are going to drive a lot more than 15,000 miles a year, so they can drive that cost down to about 19 cents per mile. Now, these companies might charge us something more like 30 cents a mile, but that's still a lot less than 64 cents a mile. And as I mentioned, you can repurpose your garage, right? And out here in the San Francisco Bay Area, if you add an extra bedroom to your house, that adds about $50,000 to the value of your house, right? So who doesn't want to do that? And the reason nobody does it now, right, is because if you want to sell the house, the person who wants to buy it wants to know that there's a garage because they might have a car to put in it. Well, when everybody's using autonomous vehicles, the person coming to buy your house, they won't have a car, so they won't value the garage. So you can turn it into a bedroom, a rec room, or whatever you would like. And there's time recovery. Now, this is pre-pandemic, but before the pandemic, 50% of the workforce in the San Francisco Bay Area had a commute in excess of 30 minutes. If I have a commute in excess of 30 minutes, I would rather be sitting back with my eyes closed, reading a book, watching a movie, talking to family and friends, or having a glass of wine, right? So people will value that time that they don't have to spend driving. From a public perspective, right, it turns out, we're pretty good drivers, but we're not perfect drivers. And it turns out when I go out on the road and I drive my car, that imposes a cost on everybody else out there, right? Why? One, simply because I'm taking up space. And if enough of us are out there, if I take up more space, that creates congestion. But the bigger cost is accidents, right? I might get distracted and I might run my car into yours, right? So there are costs that I impose on others by driving in the form of accidents. Well, if you look at the costs that everybody is imposing on everybody else when they're out there driving, accidents drive about 25% of congestion. And if we could eliminate accidents, we could eliminate 25% of all the congestion out there. That's significant. Accidents just in the United States result in 40,000 deaths each year and send about 2 million people to the emergency room, right? And 90% or more of these accidents are caused by human error, right? Not vehicular malfunction, but human error. So the notion is that if we can take the human out of the equation, then we could substantially reduce accidents. And I'm reasonably convinced that that's likely to happen. It's also, as I was talking about, the increased productivity from not driving, right? The time that we spend driving now has value. And so if you add up the value of all that time spent driving and the value of saving lives, the value of not sending people to emergency rooms, the value of reduced congestion, it's estimated that the public benefit would be about $1.3 trillion a year. Right, the benefit of the benefit to all of us, the shared benefit of $1.3 trillion a year. Now that's about 5% of US GDP, so that's a lot of money. It's not as though somebody was putting dollars in your pocket, but they'll be putting time back on your hands, right? And so that's a compelling reason to make the transition from a public perspective. All right, and here's sort of a breakdown. Accident avoidance is about $500 billion of that. Increased productivity is another $500 billion. Then we get productivity from reduced congestion. We get fuel savings of about $158 billion. And then fuel savings because of reduced congestion of about $11 billion. You add all that up, you got about $1.3 trillion in savings. So that's one reason the governments should encourage change. Here are a bunch of others. Mobility and equity considerations, right? Consider the elderly or the disabled. Then they'll be able to call Uber, Google, Lyft, Ford, GM, Apple, whoever, and say, hi, I have a wheelchair. Please send a vehicle that will readily accept my wheelchair and take me from here to there. Or I can't see, so send me a vehicle that will help with that. Or I just don't walk very well and I can't drive. So vehicles will be much more available to people like that. From an equity standpoint, turns out a lot of low-income workers, when they commute, they go from residential areas to residential areas, but most public transportation goes from residential to commercial. So a lot of low-income workers have to have their own car. They have to have their own car, but they don't have very much money, so it's going to be an inexpensive car that maybe breaks down a lot. They would be better served, I argue, by being able to just call an autonomous vehicle. Safety, we talked about. Productivity, we talked about. Environment, let's talk a little bit about some environmental implications. I think it would speed the transition to electric vehicles. It would also reduce the amount of parking or searching for parking that goes on. It turns out that in a congested urban environment, 25% of the vehicles in that congestion are looking for a parking space. So that would reduce congestion. That's better for the environment. And over here on the left-hand side, most places, if you build a 2-bedroom apartment, now you also have to add a parking space. That increases the amount of space necessary to build that apartment by about 50%. Right. Well, if you don't need that parking space, then you can do other things with that space. Maybe build more apartments, maybe add in more green space. Right. So there are a variety of things that you can do that might be better for the environment. Over on the right-hand side, is a church, but it represents every church and synagogue across the country. What do they all have in common? Almost all of them have a very big, very underutilized parking lot right next to them. Very heavily utilized when services are going on, otherwise not so much. You could imagine with autonomous vehicles, maybe that parking lot could be 1/4 its current size, because now you just need pickup and drop off, right? You don't need everybody to park because the autonomous vehicles will go someplace else. So that could be better for the environment. Imagine all of the surface parking that exists now, that could be turned into something else. I would love it if it got turned into green space. That probably won't happen. It'll get turned into maybe an office building like that. But at any rate, it's a more productive use of the space. So from an environmental perspective, autonomous vehicles will hopefully help substantially. I just got a notice that my internet is unstable. I hope that you're not having problems hearing me. Okay, so a little bit more on the environment, right? We talked about the improved resource utilization. We don't need to make so many cars. There'll be more efficient travel. The vehicles will be right-sized. If I'm one person going from A to B, the vehicle will be small. If I'm 8 people, it'll be big. It'll be optimized routes. These cars will always be taking consideration of traffic, road closures, and what have you, and they'll go the most efficient way from here to there. And will be reduced congestion for all of the reasons that we talked about, and there's no searching for parking. There may well be increased vehicle miles traveled, but if the cars are electric, I'm okay with that. There'll be cleaner technologies, they'll be electric, and they'll also be lighter. Right? Our cars are very heavy now. They're very heavy because sometimes we run into each other. Right? We run into each other with a frequency that suggests that we need a large amount of protection. But if our cars aren't running into each other, or at least not very hard, then we don't need the kind of protection in the vehicles that we have now. That will make them lighter. On the other hand, we're going to have lots of equipment on board, computer equipment, and the computers require energy, and they are also heavy. So that's a little bit of a detractor from an environmental perspective. It's also probably true that we'll get increased urban sprawl. People who work in urban environments will now live further away because they don't have to drive. Right? And if we all had internal combustion engines, that would be bad, but we probably won't. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. All right, so what changes will this bring? Here's a category of 8, a list of 8 different categories in which we'll get some change. One is from a disposable income perspective. Right, I mentioned how it costs about $9,700 to own a car. There are estimates that you can replace those services with transportation as a service, autonomous vehicles, for about $3,000. So you're going to have $6,700 in disposable income that you're not spending on your car anymore. And that's a pretty hefty chunk of change for most people. Government finance is going to be thrown for a little bit of a loop. Think about all the revenues that the local governments get from parking. Right. And so if they own the parking lot, they get the parking revenue, they get taxes on parking, they get parking tickets, right? Revenue from parking tickets, from speeding tickets, from DUIs, from reckless driving tickets, right? All of that revenue will go away with autonomous vehicles. At the same time, you don't have to hire meter mains because there aren't any meters. You won't have to have the police out there doing traffic control because the cars will do that on their own. So revenues will go down, yes, but expenditures will go down as well. So lots of changes at the local government level. Transportation demand. Right? Are people going to be demanding that they be able to drive more miles or less? Well, that's a little bit of economics 101. As the cost of anything goes down, people want to do more of it. right? So since I suggested the cost of going from here to go to there is going to go down, more people are going to want to go from here to there. What about transportation infrastructure? Well, currently we spend most of our transportation infrastructure money extending roads, right? Making them longer, making them wider, right? Well, with autonomous vehicles, I'll argue that there won't be so much benefit to making them longer and making them wider because congestion will be much less important, much less of a thing. So we can spend that transportation money maybe fixing potholes. I don't know about where you live, but where I live, we have a lot of potholes and they don't get fixed as readily as they should. It's also true that fixing potholes has of government investments, fixing a pothole has perhaps the highest rate of return of any government investment. And why is that? Well, because a little pothole, frankly, not very expensive to fix, but if 1,000 cars drive over the pothole, that's incurring a lot of damage on those 1,000 cars, right? So potholes are cheap to fix, and it saves the public quite a lot of money. From a housing perspective, I don't know what things are like in Casper, but nationwide, there is a shortage of housing. We were talking about home prices in Jackson earlier, so there's also clearly a shortage of housing in Jackson. But nationwide, there is a shortage of housing, but with autonomous vehicles, I think it's going to be easier to build housing, right? It's going to be easier to build because, you know, where I live, whenever somebody stands up and says, I want to build some housing, everybody else stands up and says, no, 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 there's too much traffic, too much congestion already. So we won't have it. We don't need any more housing. So there are roadblocks to building more housing, right? Those roadblocks should go away. There'll be less congestion. It's also true that maybe 2-bedroom houses will become 3, 3-bedroom houses will become 4, 4-bedroom houses will become 5. So our existing housing stock will be able to serve more people. So housing would become less of an issue. Public transportation. Let's talk about public transportation. I think I have a slide. Yep. On public transportation, right? I think the implications for public transportation are a little ambiguous. When I first started thinking about this issue and autonomous vehicles, I started thinking, well, what's the problem faced by public transportation? If we could solve what's called the first mile and the last mile problem, more people would take public transportation. What are the first mile and last mile problem? Those problems are, well, the first mile problem is getting people from their house to where public transportation starts, right? If that's a fair distance, I'm going to make it harder for people to use public transportation. The last mile problem is getting people from where public transportation ends to their office, to the grocery store, to wherever they're going, right? Well, my first thought was that autonomous vehicles can solve the first and last mile problems because, well, if you need to get to public transportation, call an autonomous vehicle, it'll take you there, boom, problem solved. Thinking a little bit more clearly, a little bit more deeply, if you're getting in an autonomous vehicle at your house to begin with, and if it's pretty cheap, why not just take it all the way to where you're going? Right. So autonomous vehicles may increase the demand for public transportation, but my sense is that they're probably going to dramatically reduce the demand for public transportation. And I think that's okay. It's okay because there are three benefits that public transportation brings about, right? One is it provides mobility service for low-income people, for people who struggle to find mobility to get from here to there. Two, it reduces congestion on the roads, right? And that has benefits for everybody. Three, partly by reducing congestion and partly by reducing the number of vehicles, it reduces pollution, right? So mobility, congestion, and pollution. Those are the three primary benefits associated with public transportation. And I honestly think that autonomous vehicles will solve all three of those problems as well. So I'm not so troubled by the notion that public transportation may go away. Now, longer haul public transportation, if you're going 30 miles on public transportation, that may be where autonomous vehicles will encourage ridership by solving the first and last mile problem. But I think the vast majority of public transportation could actually go away. Right, now let's turn to what is probably the biggest public policy issue. And that is that, well, if you imagine for a minute, all of the people out there who drive for a living, whether they drive a taxi, a truck, a delivery vehicle, all of them are going to be put out of a job. As I've talked about, we're going to be producing far fewer cars. So people in car production jobs and car parts production jobs, a lot of them will be put out of work. There'll be no more gas stations, vehicle repair shops, or body shops. So everybody who owns one of those, works in one of those, they're going to have to find something other to do. We need fewer police and fire, fewer healthcare workers. Remember that cars send 2 million people to the emergency room every year. Right? With autonomous vehicles, that won't happen so much. I see there are 2 questions in the chat. So what will fuel long-haul trucking? That's a really good question, Margot. I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. And will there be difficulty getting a vehicle when needed? Let me bring those both back up once I finish presenting the material. I'm almost done here, and then we can unmute you and we can just chat about it.
Okay.
All right. So big employment issues, and what to do about that. And I think Margot and I were talking about it before we got started. I think that there is an obligation on the part of the government to spend a lot of money helping workers who are displaced. Right, the societal benefits are so big that we should facilitate their coming about, and we should do that by providing job retraining, really aggressive job retraining for people who are going to lose their jobs. Or maybe geographical relocation, right? I'm here with this set of skills, but all of the jobs that value that set of skills are over there. So maybe we help people get from here to there. Not only good for those people, but also good for the economy, right? Okay, so as I mentioned, there are $1.3 trillion worth of public benefits. We should be able to spend part of that retraining these folks. And then I mentioned parking. There's going to be there are going to be many fewer parking lots. It is true that in urban areas, there's peak demand in the morning and there's peak demand in the afternoon. And what are all those cars going to do during the day? Well, service providers will probably have parking lots in some urban areas. They won't be parking lots that are the same as we think of parking lots now, because one of the defining features of a parking lot now is that you have to be able to get any car that's in there out at any time. And that won't be the case when we're in the heaven version of autonomous vehicles. You only need to get the last car out, right? So parking lots can be much smaller, much more efficient. Cars can be very close to each other. And the first car that went in, maybe it doesn't come out for days, who knows? Street parking largely be a thing of the past. In San Rafael, where I live, there's 4th Street, that's with a street with all the restaurants and retail and movie theater and whatnot. It has, I like to describe it as saying that it has 6 lanes of traffic, right? The outer 2 lanes are for our sidewalks. The middle 2 lanes in each direction are for parking. And then there are the 2 lanes on the inside, right? 4 cars going back and forth. If we could get rid of those middle lanes, turn all of the parking lanes into additional sidewalk, or maybe into outdoor dining or into green space, right? There are innumerable better ways to use those spaces. So I think that will be lovely. And this last bullet, shopping mall and apartment parking, the shopping mall parking, this is sort of pre-COVID thinking, but I don't know what's going to happen to shopping malls in the future, but to the extent that they still exist, they're not going to need the massive parking lots that surround them. What are we going to do? That could be converted to more housing. It could be converted to more shopping mall. All the parking around apartments, we talked about that. We could make more apartments, or we could make some more of the lovely green space that you see over there on the right-hand side. Right. So let me give you an idea now as to just how big a deal parking is. Right. This is very California centric, but in Los Angeles, 14% of the incorporated land area is devoted to parking. 14%, that doesn't sound so bad, but Los Angeles is pretty big. So that's 200 square miles of land is devoted to parking. In San Francisco, there's more than 250,000 on-street parking spaces. Right? And that's enough to parallel park a line of cars 60 miles longer than California's 840-mile coastline. Right? So you can park, that parallel parks cars for a line of 900 miles. That's a lot of space. Nationwide, it's estimated that there are 500 million parking spaces. That's larger than Delaware and Rhode Island combined. Right? So all of the space that are occupied by Delaware and Rhode Island is equivalent to the space occupied by parking. It could be that there are as many as 2 billion parking spaces. Add in Connecticut and Vermont. So if there are 2 billion parking spaces, that's enough space to cover Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Vermont. That's a lot of space that we could be using better. Right. Okay, let me summarize, and then we'll chat a bit. There's going to be massive employment upheaval. As many 10 million people could lose their jobs, but it's going to be over a 10-year period. But that's still 1 million jobs a year. Local government finances will be very different. Some revenue sources will be way down, but some expenditure categories will also be down. Housing will be easier to build and more plentiful, and parking conversions are going to be commonplace, I hope, because nobody likes having a parking lot nearby. Right, demand for transportation infrastructure is likely to decline. Transportation infrastructure technology, our roads will become smarter, so that's a business opportunity for somebody. And I do think that demand for public transportation is going to go down. I think that's okay, right? Because I think autonomous vehicles have sufficient benefits in mobility and congestion reduction and in emissions reduction that it's okay if public transportation slowly goes away. And I think they're coming sooner than people think. Now, this talk has been a little Pollyanna-ish. So here's a slide with some problems. Is if the cars are all electric, can our current electric grid handle it? Well, I don't know. I'm not an electric grid expert, but I talk to electric grid experts, and they say yes, because most of the charging will happen at night. And a lot of these transportation as a service providers, Uber, Google, Lyft, Ford, GM, Apple, whoever, they're going to have big parking lots out in the middle of nowhere. They're all covered with solar panels. Right, so we'll have a lot more solar. So they're not worried about that. Now, the mining for rare earth minerals for making batteries, a lot of people are worried about that. I don't have an answer. Battery technology is improving really, really fast. Hopefully that will take care of that problem, but I don't know for sure that it will. Hacking of autonomous vehicles. Look, I'm just convinced that there are very smart people out there who are aware of this and are working on this issue, and that they'll solve the problem. I can come up with a few very inelegant solutions, so I'm sure that there are people out there coming up with elegant solutions. Competition and service provision, right? In Casper, it may be that there's only one service provider. Right? If there's one service provider, that's a monopoly, which means that the rates could be very, very high. Right? That means that there needs to be some government regulation, and the costs of entry aren't that high. Maybe local governments could start a car share service of their own to compete with the private sector. Right? And there are many, many more concerns that people are actively working on. Also, a bunch of investment opportunities. Parking lots and garages, they'll go away. Buying them now, you could turn them into something else. Transportation technology is going to be a big deal. Certain residential properties. My house that I rent out, I live on a boat. That house that I rent out is right next to a freeway. And once cars are autonomous and electric, the freeway will not only be quieter, but there will be less pollution in the air. So the value of properties near freeways, as an example, will go up. Apartment complexes, their value should go up because you can build more apartments on the same land. And then infrastructure technology. I'm not sure why I've got that up there twice. At any rate, that's what I've got. Now I'm going to take you through a brief history of the course, right? We started off with Jeff Woglam, provided an update on the economy. He talked, I'm sure, a lot about inflation. Inflation's still an issue. When I give a talk like that, I talk about recession, and I am still an optimist that we're not going to go into recession, but it's getting harder and harder to maintain that position. And you had Alan Deardorff talk about trade. You had Sarah Jacobson talk about climate change. Sarah Jacobson, also the chair of Needs Board. I hope you enjoyed her. And then I think you had Mike Shore talk about the black-white wealth gap, Kelly Cullen on income inequality, and today was autonomous vehicles. And here's a slide with information on how to contact me. I will send a link to these slides to Kat, who hopefully will send it out to all of you. And if you have questions after we're through here today, please feel free to toss me an email and give a shout, and I'll be happy to communicate with you. All right, let me stop my share now. And if any of you have any questions, let's go ahead and just unmute ourselves, and we can have a conversation about autonomous vehicles.
This is Margot, and I asked you the one about the long haul current trucking that's going on. Are they using still diesel? And how do these autonomous vehicles fuel themselves?
Yeah, I think with the long haul truckle as it's going on now, there's a driver in the cab. He's not driving, but or he or she is there to get the vehicle out on the highway, and there to as you've identified the issue of fueling, right? When fueling needs to happen, you could imagine a future where there are fueling stops. There's nobody in the truck pulls up, and they figured out how to automate it. Or maybe there's a gas station attendant, like back in the day for cars. The answer is I don't know exactly, but I'm sure that there are people working hard on those issues. And you also asked, I think, how long is it going to take for an autonomous vehicle to come and pick us up? And my suspicion is not very long. These companies are going to use very sophisticated algorithms to predict where people are going to want to ride and make sure that there's a car there, because they're going to want to work hard to make sure that we end up in heaven as opposed to hell, right? Those who are making the big investments in autonomous vehicles want us to end up in heaven, because that's how they make money on their investment, right? And that means providing quick, clean, and adequate service. So I'm pretty optimistic, and I'm looking at it through an economic lens. I think it's going to be a pretty favorable change. Now, what's often pointed out to me is that many people don't look at buying a car as really an economic issue, and buying a car is often about making a personal statement, right? If you buy a Ferrari, you're making a personal statement. If you buy a Porsche, you're making a personal statement, or a Mercedes, you're making a personal statement. So people use the purchase of a car for individual marketing, and so that might encourage us to head off into the hell state of the world, but I hope not. It may just be that we end up in heaven with a bunch of people who still feel like making a marketing statement through their car, and so that there might be some private ownership, and it won't be entirely fleet based. But I suspect that there are an awful lot of people like me who will very gladly dispense of car ownership, because I don't like putting gas in it. I don't like paying the insurance bill on it. I don't like taking it to the the repair shop. I would much rather do other things with my time, but only time will tell.
Now I have a question. What will personal family vacations look like?
Well, so it will, if you want to do a road trip, it will be in a vehicle that's designed specifically for that road trip, right? Imagine that you're going to go to Jackson Hole to go skiing with 8 people. And then you pick up your phone and you say, we're going skiing. We're going between January 3 and January 10. There will be 8 of us. Send a car with a ski rack and with enough space in it for all of our gear. And then that car will be yours for that week, right? You won't have to load and unload every time you get into or out of the vehicle. It'll be yours. Imagine it's just a rented vehicle, only it's autonomous. And again, what's going to be great about it is it's going to be a vehicle designed for that purpose, right? And to the extent that people still want to own their own car, now maybe they won't feel like owning a car that's sufficient for something that you only have to do once a year, right? So you don't need as big a car. You can buy a smaller car because you can just call up Uber, Google, Lyft, whoever, and say, send me a big car for that once a year time when you need a bigger car.
This is Steve Parker, if I can ask a question.
Hi, Steve.
I came in a little late, but in Wyoming, I don't think that I personally am not so opposed to nuclear energy. There's going to be such a demand for electricity, and it can't be covered by just the sun, the different natural parts, but I bet we will have a lot of either mining or other research for safe nuclear energy, cover this gap of what this change you're suggesting will happen. I mean, it'll turn the world upside down, but I don't know how you can do it without some nuclear energy. That's the only source I know that's big enough and we could probably find enough nuclear uh, production that is
Yeah.
safer.
Yeah, Stephen, I agree with you entirely. I was listening to a podcast not long ago about a nuclear energy. It was a nuclear energy expert talking, and he completely converted me. There's so much ignorance out there about nuclear energy. But if you take just the simple statistic of how many people die from each energy source in a given year, nuclear is literally the safest. It's literally the safest, right? Even when you adjust from, the volume of gasoline produced energy is really high, the volume of nuclear produced energy is pretty low. Even when you make that adjustment, it is the safest, right? The number of people killed per sort of kilowatt hour of energy produced, cars creating pollution, that pollution kills. Nuclear doesn't create pollution. It creates some nuclear waste that there's an issue. But if you deal with it well, it's not an issue. So I agree with you completely. We really do need to turn to nuclear. That means we need a massive, massive marketing campaign because it's got such a bad rap.
When you presented this on autonomous cars, you were looking at a metropolitan area. I'm trying to envision it in sparsely populated Wyoming, and I don't see how it works.
Yeah, it may not. It may not in sparsely populated areas. It may be that in places like Casper, and I apologize, I don't know exactly how big Casper is, but it may be that it will be primarily individual car ownership. But even if it's sort of the preponderance of drivers that turn to transportation as a service, that still keeps us in the heaven version.
Okay, the population in the city is around 50,000, and I think for the county it's about 65,000.
Okay,
That
sounds.
would work.
Yeah, that sounds to me big enough so that there could be room for a couple of car share services.
Okay.
Now, if you live 50 miles outside of town, then car share is probably not going to be the thing for you. You probably need your own autonomous vehicle.
As far as farming and ranching and farming, how do you see their needs being cared for?
So the actual plowing of the field and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so a lot of that is already autonomous. That's been a big market. I went and toured the port of, this is a little different, but I went and toured the port of Rotterdam. This must be 15 years ago, 17 years ago, and it was fully autonomous, right? The containers being loaded onto ships and being offloaded and moved around the port were being done with autonomous vehicles. It's the same thing as happening in farming. It's not a random thing how you plow a field. So having an autonomous vehicle do it makes a lot of sense, and it's happening. All right. Any other questions, comments, or thoughts?
How do you think it will change the employment market?
Quite a bit.
Yeah, where you're talking about a lot of people losing their jobs.
Yeah.
Where do you see employment? This is maybe not related, but where does it grow?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Margot, and I confess I probably haven't devoted enough energy to it. My just flat out guess is that it would encourage existing migration trends towards urban environments, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I'm gonna have to devote more energy and effort to it, but hopefully not. But that's what I fear.
Do you think it might lead to shorter work weeks or more vacation time? So that more people can be employed?
Yeah, I'm not sure how autonomous vehicles would influence those things.
Okay.
Hopefully we're headed in that direction. But I'm not sure how autonomous vehicles would affect those things.
And how would emergency vehicles, how would that work?
Well, you'd probably have ambulances out there, EMTs out there, well, with human beings in them, but not driving.
Okay.
That's my guess.
Okay.
Is
Uh,
it the same with fire?
I'm sorry.
Is it the same with fire?
Probably. And it'd certainly be easier for fire trucks to make it from the fire station to the house, because I don't know about where you are, but where I am, people aren't always very responsive to sirens. But autonomous vehicles will be the epitome of responsiveness. Right? They'll just move right out of the way so that the vehicle can get through.
Mhm.
It'll be an interesting change for the future.
It's going to be very interesting. I think we live in interesting times in the next 10 years, and the human driven car is going to be very interesting to see what happens.
I personally wouldn't mind having a car drive me.
Margot, I'm right there with you, and I'm somebody who does like to say that I like to drive. But most of the time when I'm in the car, I would rather not.
And I say I would rather be chauffeured.
Right there with you, and I have to believe that there are a lot of people that feel that way. There are so many people. Oh, I really like to drive, and I've thought a lot about that, and where I've come down is that it's a psychological thing, right? If you ask most parents how they feel about the public school that their child goes to, oh, it's terrific, it's a wonderful school, it's the perfect school for my child. Well, it might not be that terrific, it might not be that wonderful, and it might not be the perfect school for your child, but it's the only one your child can go to. So in your head, okay, I'm really happy with it. Well, I think the same thing happens with driving, right? You might hate it, but you play this psychological game with yourself that says, no, I don't really hate this. I really like driving. I want to get back in the car. I want to drive more, because you don't have any other options. And it's kind of a self-defense mechanism.
I think people also have a sense of control when they are driving versus being in
yeah.
some sort of public
There is
transport.
that too. And control and freedom and all of those things. Yep. So going to be very interesting to see how and exactly where it plays out, right? There are going to be some parts of the country where it's going to play out more slowly than others, because people's view of driving is different. And I'm kind of excited to watch the change happen.
So you brought up earlier when I was talking to you, maybe when Penny was online, that blizzards are a problem. Could you address weather a little bit?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of testing going on in Finland, right? Because Finland has weather. And it turns out that, when programmed correctly, these cars actually do as well in blizzards, if not better, than people do, right? You live in a place that gets a lot of weather. You must know some people who are better at driving in it than other people. Right. Well, these cars are all going to be as good as the best person at driving in a blizzard. Right. There isn't going to be a range of abilities in these cars. They're going to be programmed with the best possible technology. And, it really is a mechanical thing, driving in a blizzard. What we respond to as humans when we're driving, the cars are going to respond to as well, only much faster. Right. Did the wheels slip a little bit? Did we slide a little bit this way? Right. And the cars are going to respond instantly, and they're going to respond in the right way, which not all human beings do.
How would they address wildlife on the road?
Well, cars, that's a good question. My guess is that, certainly at night, these cars are going to be able to see a deer up on the road before a human driver would. I like to think that they'll be better at dealing with wildlife than people will, but I
Mm.
don't know that for sure.
Yeah, because deer don't always play fair. They can dart
No,
out fast.
indeed, indeed. Well, lots of little animals do. I was riding my bicycle. This was a couple of years ago now. I was riding my bicycle, and I saw, maybe 20 yards away, there was a raccoon, and I made a mental note. But the next thing I know, the raccoon was charging at me.
Oh,
And so you're absolutely right.
yeah. Well, it's interesting to know that it's not as far off as being in a rural area.
Yeah.
I don't always know what's going on with development of new things. So it's interesting that you see it not that far down the road happening.
Yeah, no, I do see it not that far down the road happening, but there are a lot of others who are much, much more skeptical.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm not alone in thinking that it's happening pretty quickly, but there is a camp out there that says, yeah, no, this is just a really hard, intractable problem. It's going to take a really long time. My answer to that is, well, there's tens of billions of dollars being devoted to it, and that's much more money than has ever been devoted to any sort of robotics in history.
Hmm.
And so this is going to happen faster than robotics experts might expect.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question internationally.
Hmm.
There, China's doing a lot with electric cars. Are they also looking at autonomous cars? And
Oh,
what
you bet.
about Europe?
Yeah,
Mm.
there are a lot of autonomous car companies in Asia. Hear less about it in Europe. The major car companies, as they are in the United States, the major car companies are sort of getting on the bandwagon, right? And you might ask the question, well, why are the human-driven car companies, why aren't they fighting this? The same way that they fought the electric vehicle in the 1970s, the same way that they've fought a bunch of other new technologies. And the answer is that they would be fighting some of the best capitalized companies in the history of the world, right? The car companies don't have pockets deep enough to go up against Google, to go up against Apple. And so they see the writing on the wall, and well, okay, we can either either fight them and lose, or we can just join them. And the major automobile producers are joining them, and that includes companies like Volvo and Mercedes in Europe.
Now in China, they're developing the electric car. And are they also looking at autonomous cars as aggressively as they are the electric cars, or is this down the road for them like it is for us?
I don't know for sure in China, but I
Okay.
imagine that there are a lot of companies who are actively pursuing it,
Okay.
because that's a monstrous market.
Yes.
All right. If there aren't any more questions, then I will thank you for coming. And I'll send this video and a link to my slides to Kat, who will hopefully forward it out to you and everybody else who is registered for the course. And I hope you enjoyed the course, and I hope that Casper invites Need to come back and put on another one of these courses at some point.
Thank you.
Thank you. I found the course great. And, when you read it, when I read about it, it just sounded kind of boring, but it's been very thought provoking and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. Well, go out and tell all your friends and have them register the next time we offer it.
All
Okay.
right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Margot and Penny. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.